Since chaos first clawed its way onto this world, Kroq-Gar has thrashed an opposition and driven it back. His entire spawning was destined for greatness, but Kroq-Gar eclipsed them all. He's seen empires rise to dominance and crumble to dust. His duty has never stopped. Defend the jungle, purge the outsiders, cleanse the rot. Today, I'm going to give Kroq-Gar a new history. The jungles of the Southlands are under siege, and the great plan is unraveling. The world is dying, but this Saurus won't see it collapse without a fight. He'll hunt down an under-empire, stand before the Chaos Gods in defiance, and face down the powers of death themselves. He is the last defender of Shotul, and the relentless executor of the great plan. This is my narrative campaign for Kroq-Gar. The jungle empire of the Lizardmen lay in ruin. The bones of once golden cities were picked clean by the vermin that laid unjust claim to the land. But it would never be theirs. Kroq-Gar would not allow it. The once gilded city of Teotihuacan was crawling with the disgusting spawn of Clan Mordkin. And while the Ratmen enjoyed an indirect approach from the shadows, such a strategy did not exist in the eyes of the Saurus. The Ratmen had fashioned their own undercity below Teotihuacan like a festering infection beneath skin. Not often ones for going underground, the Lizardmen did what needed to be done, and tore the undercity to flinders, slaughtering any clan rats in their path. Kroq-Gar was an unwavering armament in seeing the great plan unfold. The ancient, time-lost shapers of the world, the old ones, had a preordained plan and destiny for everything. Although, being ancient and time-lost, they're not there to confirm nor deny the finer details, leaving some room for interpretation. One truth, however, was absolute. The Skaven were an error that needed erasing. This land did not want them, and Kroq-Gar made sure they knew. With a foothold established, the Saurus Defense Force followed the sounds of scratching, chittering, and general cowardly noises back into the jungle. For one so small, they left an obvious trail, and despite false claims that the jungle was theirs by usurped right, they never got a handle on their fear of the deep, dark places. But then, Skaven have never really got a handle on their fear of anything. Their lack of discipline was confusing. They wanted to win, but they did not want to fight. They wanted to kill, but they were not prepared to die. They called themselves warriors, yet filled the air with the musk of fear whenever the Saurus drew near. When the Skaven of Clan Mordkin and Clan Morbidus forged a shaky alliance to assault the Saurus from the rear, the Oldblood merely readied his forces and relished the promise of double active combat duty. If an 8,000-year-old cold-blooded killer was capable of smiling, I assure you he'd have been beaming. Like flesh fighting an infection, the jungle strained against the Ratmen. The Skaven would always scatter, regroup, and return. They were insufferable in that regard. And knowing he couldn't kill each and every one of them, Kroq-Gar approached the problem from another angle. He would break them. Every time they moved their forces, he would be there waiting. Hidden in those dark places the Skaven were too afraid to tread. The scattered remains of the clan kept running, and the unrelenting retribution of the forest did not waver. Kroq-Gar had all the patience in the world for his prey. Not that he would need it, as the remains of the Mordkin survivors decided to place themselves in a trap of their own making, allowing themselves to be cornered like, well, rats. Only a handful of the Skaven survived, and the slaughter tipped their deranged minds over the precipice and into madness, as they later threw themselves at local settlements in mad, suicidal attacks. Clan Morbidus appeared to welcome the macabre fate of their northern neighbors, as it distracted Kroq-Gar long enough for them to enact their fiendish scheme. They poured forth from their wretched tunnels and swarmed over the Golden Tower, Kroq-Gar's capital and seat of power, This was not part of the great plan. This was not part of any plan. These were the actions of lunatics, and the Old Blood would have their heads for it. The Skaven would be punished. No, not punished. That implies their behavior could be corrected. They have always been treacherous, and they always will be. The only way to correct them was to eradicate them. A purge. They must be massacred without hesitation or mercy. His Saurus locked the clan rats in place, while Kroq-Gar and his riders surged from the forest and brought them down in a flurry of teeth, claws, and clubs. His brutal culling of the Skaven had to be absolute, and he followed the trail of corruption south. The deeper they pressed into the jungle, the more their taint seeped into the lifeblood of the land. As though infested with weeping sores, sickly green pus seeped from gangrenous wounds in the earth. The runoff from unholy experiments in the Ratmen's subterranean burrows. Kroq-Gar did not hate the Skaven, in the way a surgeon does not hate a malignant, cancerous growth. Both simply do what must be done. They remove it. It is an impurity, an abnormality, a mistake. At every turn, the Saurus were waiting. Despite their size and numbers, they moved through the jungle unheard. And when the Ratmen finally spotted them, it was too late. Their fate was penned, and as their black blood drained back into the earth, the jungle began to heal. Balance was slowly restored, and threads of a larger fate were pulled taut. The great plan was in motion, though the Lizardmen were about 80 to 90% sure there were no ogres involved in said plan. And so, without much thought nor warning, they collapsed on and slaughtered a band of ogres that were wandering around the jungle. No one knows how they got there, or what they were doing, and they would not be missed. They did make good eating though, and the riders were thrilled to hear that meat was back on the menu. There were stirrings of change around the Southlands. The Tomb Kings sought to strike a bargain with the Lizardmen, but Kroq-Gar didn't trust them given their lack of skin and obvious evilness. Teclis of the Elves was a beacon of order in a chaotic sea, and as far as warmbloods go, he was all right in Kroq-Gar's eyes. The dwarves were squabbling with their neighbors as dwarves tend to do, and it was clear that that would come to violence someday. There was news of a bloody and forsaken war raging in the west, one that had claimed the life of Manfred von Karstein. He would be missed by no one.
Pitiful little gods that they were true.
Kroq-Gar had defended his lands for millennia. So much had been lost, but he would take it back, inch by bloody inch. He'd reclaim the ancient artifacts and time-lost weapons of his people that had been scavenged by cruel and dastardly forces. The mighty spear of Tlanshla, that which can split boulders and hew dragons, had been taken by the Druki, the Dark Elves. Whatever twisted mockery of a scheme they had formed was about to be unraveled as they learned rule number 1 of jungle warfare. No plan survives contact with the enemy, especially when the enemy happens to be a dinosaur. The elves sent battalions of witch elves and shades to halt the intruders. What they expected to do against a carnosaur, I don't know, but they obviously were not successful. The skulking shades scrounging around the swamp were all eviscerated by the stampeding monsters, and this momentum carried them all the way to the main force. The elves called upon the dark powers that drove them, taken by transcendental frenzies of bloodlust and cruelty. War hydras motivated by the cruel bite of the whip were sent barreling into the Lizardmen, and Kroq-Gar was sickened by such mistreatment. The elves saw everything around them as flesh to be dominated and bent to their will. Their ignorance was amusing, the Saurus thought. Almost as amusing as their decision to charge into battle with nothing to protect their weak, squishy flesh. The Druki were driven out of the swamp, and the spear of Tlanshla rested in the hands of Kroq-Gar. The great plan was unfolding, and he would be the cold, cutting steel that made way for it. The Old Ones, Kroq-Gar's long-departed masters weren't the only ones with plans for this world. The gods of chaos had their own ambitions. They were incorrect. They were heretical. They were perverse. Some more than others. The taint of Tzeentch crawled over the lands like mold on fruit. The god of magic sought to bring change to the unchanging. This was, of course, all a game to him. And he knew Kroq-Gar could not resist the challenge once he laid out the pieces. Something wasn't right. The Saurus had stormed in and taken a city with no resistance. Tzeentch does not give things away freely. He had laid a trail of breadcrumbs for Kroq-Gar, one that would lead him right up to the Dark God's chosen champion, Kairos the Fateweaver. The trap had been set and sprung. And as the last defenders neared Kairos and his forces, the air itself rippled and cracked, as impossible burnings of light cascaded towards the Lizardmen. The incandescent mix of pinks and purples made skin twitch and retinas hum, and as it jetted towards the Saurus, it clung to flesh and burned from the inside out. Kroq-Gar was not honed in the way of magic, but he did not feel that was a disadvantage right now, because he had something a bit more effective. The greatest of the Carnosaurs, Grimlock. Rider and mount had forged a bond across countless battlefields, and Kairos was about to learn about the true power of friendship, as 10 tons of raw, unbridled fury bounded towards him. The swell of Saurus braced the magical onslaught and advanced step by grueling step. But the searing lights began to splutter and fade. The demons unleashing the kaleidoscope of ravenous energy became the playthings of the Carnosaurs and Horned Ones. Tzeentch did not show his puppet Kairos this future, and the Lord of Change seemed surprised to see Grimlock approach, hungry for bird flesh. With their leader torn to shreds, the rest of the Chaos followers fled or slipped their planar bonds and disappeared. Kairos was sent back across the sea, but Kroq-Gar would not pursue him. That wasn't part of the plan, and for now, the war was over. Despite Teclis being absolutely no help at all so far, he was trusted with the defense of the southern tip, while Kroq-Gar turned his attention. Oh, no, wait, they've killed Teclis. Okay, war's back on, I suppose. Kroq-Gar's frustrations were compounded when he met this second Chaos incursion in the field, led by mutated little bags of flesh, teeth and tentacles, riding around on hoverboards. There were no hoverboards in the Great Plan, and for this detail alone, he took great pride in dragging the heretical little meatballs down to earth and smushing them into the dirt. Whether it was the mocking visage of Kairos, the unjust death of the closest thing he had to an ally, or something else entirely, something compelled Kroq-Gar to take his troops and cross the forsaken southern seas. This compulsion was clearly part of something greater, as it had called to another great disruptor of the ruinous powers. His favorite little skink, Oxyotl. As though knowing this was all building to an earth-shattering, fateful confrontation, Kairos roused his twisted legions to attack the Lizardmen, not seeming to comprehend that he was antagonizing two beings who had walked the earth since the Great Catastrophe, since Chaos first tricked its way into this world. Kroq-Gar and Oxyotl had spent millennia killing demons and hellspawn and disrupting the Dark God's great game. To Kairos, this was a destined encounter, two worlds colliding, a Lord of Change pulling the strings in the endgame. But to the Lizardmen, this was a brief, inconsequential blip. A mundane, forgettable, inconsequential detail. The forces of Chaos were dispatched without fanfare or effort, and Kairos' accursed citadel was stormed and captured. The Saurus entrusted it to the skink, and he knew the situation was under control. The failure of one god made way for the ambitions of another. Dawn's Light, a city which had been the epicenter of all bad tidings for weeks, was having another terrible day as it was overrun by a Slaneshi horde. The thought of the good and honorable Lizardmen population being whipped and poked and prodded by a bunch of perverts was too much for Kroq-Gar to bear, especially when he found out that one group of Saurus seemed to like it and decided to join the Slaaneshi army. They were classed as degenerates, and the Oldblood ordered his army to stay away from them, lest they spread their hedonistic lifestyle among his ranks. The warriors of Slaanesh were fast and deadly, but they made a fatal mistake. They stood still. They let the Lizardmen come to them, and once the horde of cold-blooded fury had gathered its momentum, nothing could stop them. The fighting was savage. Every wound inflicted drove the deviants into renewed frenzy, and the losses suffered were great. Though the Chaos invasion was driven back, both Slaanesh and Tzeentch had made their moves and retreated to lick their wounds. Other matters wrestled for the Saurus Lord's attention. He left a detachment on the lookout for future raids and/or Slaaneshi lizard orgies and returned north. One of the jungle's great temple cities had been awakened by the High Elves. This was a disturbance. This was unplanned. Intruders had arrived and sought to harness the power of the solar engine. They intended to use it against the forces of evil, but their motives and their allegiances mattered not. They were trespassing. And this was sacred ground. And so, they must die. The vanguard wave of Carnosaurs and riders stormed over the bridge and towards the elven mages. Trumpets and roars sounded in the distance as reinforcements arrived. The elves had spared no expense in ensuring their victory here. Their great swordsmen of Hoeth stood firm against the Saurus and pressed them back. But like most foes Kroq-Gar had faced, they had an undeniable weakness to being eaten by a dinosaur. The expedition carried on further north, and the rumblings of another insidious plot rose to light. This time, from an old foe. These were dark days, and the great Lord Kroq was to be awakened to guide the Lizardmen in these uncertain times. Around him swelled a roiling sea of magic and power, and like moths to a flame came the Skaven. No one is quite sure what they hoped to achieve, what they would have done if they managed to reach Lord Kroq, nor why they sent their forces in individual waves rather than attacking all at once. The Saurus stood resolute as the dregs of the Under-Empire spilled forth, each assault becoming increasingly more deranged and idiotic. The ritual would not be interrupted. Kroq-Gar would see to that. With Lord Kroq awakened, the next phase of the great plan would begin. The winds of death were blowing nearby. An ancient evil stirred beneath the sands. The world was dying, and a great necromancer wanted to bind its corpse and rule for eternity. The winds whispered the accursed name, Nagash. And the return of this great evil was in motion, and the great plan demanded they be put to rest. Settra the Imperishable brought his long-dead warriors and the constructs of his ancient empire to stop Kroq-Gar's march into the desert. The Saurus took to the dunes and stared down all that the King of the Dead brought to bear. Two great warriors faced each other. One had walked the earth for millennia, emerged victorious from 10,000 battlefields, and had made entire civilizations tremble in their wake. The other was Settra. Kroq-Gar placed his faith in his fierce Saurus warriors. Few leaders would have trusted their force so resolutely in the face of such terrible designs. Timeless beasts of bone and baleful magic tore through them, but they did not falter. The front line heaved and groaned, shifting like the sands that flowed beneath. The great and powerful Lord Kroq showed the Forsaken Tomb Kings what true power is, drawing on timeless magics to devastate their ranks, summoning the stars themselves to incinerate the undead. Settra recognized and respected power. and Lord Kroq was unlike anything he'd seen in life or his long, eternal undeath. He rode towards him, ready to cut down the mage priest. Kroq-Gar caught the king's motives, and he and Grimlock bounded towards him, intent on saving Kroq. They say Settra had 1,000 titles. Unfortunately for him, Dinosaur Slayer was not one of them, and he was overwhelmed absolutely by the onslaught. As the King of Kings was beaten back, the dark binding holding his forces together wavered. All at once, 100,000 bones thudded into the soft sand. And once again, there was silence on the dunes. The Lizardmen established a foothold in the accursed lands and readied themselves for their war against death. Though they were not the only ones standing up to this grim future. Volkmar, Grand Theologian of the Cult of Sigmar, was dispensing righteous fury upon the Tomb Kings, laying siege to the accursed pyramid of Nagash. He too had heard the rumblings of the great necromancer's resurrection.
It is my sworn duty to rid the world of chaos and all who facilitate them.
And he too knew that if that plan came to fruition and Nagash returned, the world would become a great sprawling land of eternal undeath. The risen dead of the Desert Kingdoms were relentless. Settra had been forced back, but one of his lieutenants led a second assault. Thousands of skeletons, giants, and constructs fell upon the Saurus. They could be smashed to dust and pounded down into the sand below, but they'd keep rising again, and again, and again. It wasn't enough to defeat the dead in combat. They needed to cut the head off the beast. Kroq-Gar stormed Khemri, extinguishing the source of Settra's power. Though this disruption caused stirrings of the dead across the continent. As the vanguard scoured the heartlands of the desert, a secondary force launched an assault to the east. High Queen Khalida was growing her power and amassing her own army of the dead. On one hand, she had spent months trying to curry favor with Kroq-Gar. She rejected the plan to resurrect Nagash, and she sought to thrash against the forces of ruination in the coming end times. On the other hand, the great plan told Kroq-Gar to kill the Bone Lady, and that's all the justification he needed. As the Lizardmen neared, the extent of Khalida's force became apparent. The dull splendor of ancient armor carpeted the rolling dunes, and the sands shuddered as the great servants of the Queen marched. Ominous necrosphinxes, unholy amalgams of mortal and immortal ideals made manifest, enacted their terrifying designs upon the Saurus. Their cruel stone blades hewed through the warriors, spreading waves of gore with every broad stroke. The Lizardmen were not without answer, however, as their own mighty beasts surged to meet the constructs. And Lord Kroq moved the cosmos. He commanded the energy of the stars align for him and be unleashed. The army was impressive, but it was a mere distraction. Khalida did not grace Kroq-Gar with her presence. Her gambit came to light. The Oldblood had been played, and Khalida had sent a secret amphibious assault to the southern jungles. The Saurus were shocked. Since when did the Tomb Kings have a navy? He could muster a force to try and stop her, pray for a blessed spawning in the birthing pools. But that could take days, weeks, maybe months. The quicker, easier, and more effective solution, he decided, was to simply find the Queen and crush her into a powder. Kroq-Gar respected Khalida. She was a warrior. She believed in something greater than herself. She was devout, brave, a defender of order and virtue. Most of all, she was defiant, in life and in death. If the Saurus could feel remorse, he might feel bad for assuming that she was a servant of Nagash, given her general bony appearance. But you don't live 8,000 years by second-guessing yourself. And so Kroq-Gar doubled down on his earlier justifications and brought her low. The Queen's final stand was Lamia, once the crown jewel of the ancient Nehekaran Empire turned into the cradle of vampirism. The war horns of the Lizardmen heralded a new age for the city, an era where it would be scrubbed clean of the musty stench of death. As Khalida was vanquished, a message came from Settra. Odd, given that Kroq-Gar was convinced Settra was dead, deader than normal, I mean. He had been clinging onto power, it seemed, clutching to the coattails of an unlikely puppet master, and so the Saurus marched to meet their final confrontation. The orchestrator of the plan to resurrect the great Nagash, the undying servant of the great betrayer, Arkhan the Black. The fury of the jungle struck the Lich, and the Lich, eager for blood sport, struck back. After snuffing out all life in Araby, his forces were poised for conquest, and the border towns between desert and jungle were swallowed in vicious conflict. For every dozen warriors killed, the right hand of Nagash summoned forth 100 more. And every time the Saurus brought down one of the Nehekaran's lumbering constructs, another was raised in the desert, humming with necromantic energy and a singular burning purpose to destroy. The power on display eclipsed anything witnessed before. Kroq-Gar could best the Tomb Kings on the battlefield. He could grind their rotten bones beneath Grimlock's thunderous charge. But they would rise from the ashes, from the dust, again and again, for as long as Arkhan the Black existed. Heroes have been killing him for thousands of years to no avail. He always came back. Battles were won, but the war was a ruthless affair. Cities were assaulted, burned, and assaulted once more, the inhabitants of which were never quite sure if they were supposed to be skeletons or lizards. A flicker of hope sparked as Volkmar the Grim declared his allegiance to the Saurus, pledging his holy fanatics to the cause. Tragically, he was dead mere moments later. A ceaseless war raged, and Kroq-Gar's neighbors, the skinks and the dwarfs, were bickering like petulant children, not seeing the looming evil on the horizon. They could not be counted on. Anyone who pledged their aid died seconds later. This was Kroq-Gar's fight, and no one else's. That was the will of the great plan. Yet another legion rose and marched toward the battered and broken remains of the once great holy city of Khemri. The defenders could hold, but something needed to shift. They needed to go on the offensive. The siege broke, and Kroq-Gar gave no respite to the dead. He marched on the black pyramid of Nagash, its ominous peak bathed in a grim reverence. There was an eerie silence that hung thick in the air, as though the monolith of forbidden law snatched all sound from its surroundings. Kroq-Gar could take it no more. This place was evil. The silence was unnatural, and he would break it with the thunderous sound of carnage and violence and destruction. Great beasts shattered the gates, and the Saurus stormed through. They swallowed the pyramid's chosen defenders underfoot and moved on, eager to be away from the heretical place. They scoured the deserts and beyond ruthlessly. Every stone, dune, and mire was overturned, leveled, and dredged in their destruction of the evil places. Settra, who'd managed to survive up till now by taking refuge in a vampire's castle, led a forlorn rebellion against the invaders. The King of Kings lay to rest eternally in a fetid bog. The lands of Araby were now a dead place. The vibrant clamour of once bustling markets was gone, replaced by the low moan of shifting bones and the sky-splitting cries of carrion birds. The Lich was here, somewhere, and Kroq-Gar was on the hunt. Cities were turned upside down, deserts were scoured, mountain passages were searched from their lowest stone to their highest peak. The coasts were conquered and the cities purged and resettled. The people of Araby were gone, but in time the fanfare would return to this land, as skinks moved into the desert towns with little reluctance. The Saurus had caught the scent of the Lich King, and the forces tightened around him like a noose. But the gambler had one last throw of the bones ready. He took Kroq-Gar off guard with some unexpected diplomacy. "Nagash who?" he said. "I'm Arkhan the Good." This was obviously rejected, and the Bone Man attacked him anyway. Destinies were denied, and others fulfilled atop the scorched dunes of Al-Hayik. The jungles had been purged, the rat men dredged up and slaughtered. The incursions of chaos had been beaten back, and the last defender of Shotl had crossed into hell itself to raise their forsaken bastions to rubble. The great rulers of the Tomb Kings, legends in their own right, were brought down one by one. And now only the most cunning and treacherous remained. Arkhan could not live. Nagash must not rise. The time of the dead shall not come, and the future is only that which will be preordained and destined by the great plan. Devout fury and divine righteousness roiled beneath the heaving mass of Kroq-Gar. Grimlock left the shattered bones of the dead in his wake, and together they surged across the battlefield like a tidal wave of ruin. The Saurus gave not an inch, and the walls of skeletal warriors faltered and collapsed. Arkhan drew on the ancient untapped power of the land, his master, his forgotten peoples, trying desperately to keep his legion from crumbling. And he never saw the great Saurus warrior coming. Great reptilian muscle heaved, and his ancient spear drove home. As Kroq-Gar's holy artifacts tore through the Lich, they seemed to cut the threads of magic that flowed around him. He toppled to the sand, but this time, the witch fires that smoldered deep in his eyes finally died out. The Lich King crumbled, then his army, and finally the last bastions holding out against the lizard forces finally broke. The treacherous king of the dead was laid to rest, finally and eternally, and the unholy ambition to return Nagash to this world was stopped for good. The world was still dying. There were still dark forces seeking to take advantage of the chaos, or fill the power vacuums left by those seeking order and stability. But evil will always exist. Villains will always vie for control. Madmen will chase power till the end of time. For now, there was a moment of peace. Aside from the bickering between the skinks and the dwarves, the Southlands were calm. Kroq-Gar returned to his post, as defender of the land and enactor of the great plan, waiting till next he's called on, to purge anyone who dares threaten his peace. And that was my Kroq-Gar campaign. If you are hearing me now, you finished it. Well done, you. My name is Willis, and this channel is my way of exploring how my favorite games can be used as little engines for stories. My main focus is on Warhammer 3, though I've plans to open it up to other games. I'll be coming out with these campaigns every few weeks, and this one was actually picked for me by the viewers of the last one. So let's do it again. I'll have a poll running for another audience campaign pick, though it will not be the next campaign. Today we stopped Nagash's return, but next time we'll be doing everything we can to see that great work unfold with an Arkhan the Black campaign. But anyway, thank you for tuning in, and I apologize if I have sounded a little ill today. It is because I'm a little bit ill. But I will see you when I am hopefully feeling a little bit better for another story.